If you want to understand what's really driving Bitcoin's all-time highs, institutional flows, and where the next big crypto moves might be, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Today, I'm joined by Sebastian, researcher at Aquanow, friend of the channel, and part of our Network Spotlight community. Sebastian just released his July market report, so let's get right into it. Welcome to the channel, Sebastian.
Thanks. I appreciate the invite, and it's always good to be here and chatting with the community.
So Bitcoin hit new all-time highs again at the time of this recording, over 120,000. We've been having record ETF inflows, back-to-back days of 1 billion. Based on the data that you're seeing, because you put out your monthly report, do you feel like we're in this euphoric phase yet, at least for Bitcoin?
My personal opinion, and again, not financial advice, is I don't think so. Like if you look at the top holders of the ETFs, they're like mostly investment advisors. So like over 10 billion of the Bitcoin ETF is held by investment advisors. That's above hedge funds, so like above the people who are trying to do the basis trade and stuff like that. So just kind of speaks to like a healthy bid. Maybe there's the idea that people are dollar cost averaging into Bitcoin ETFs as they buy their paycheck. So you kind of just have this nice steady flow, and maybe that flows into ETH as well, and maybe other listed products as they come on. And so I think that that's unique. And the a lot of the exposure is kind of moderate. It seems like funding rates haven't gotten too crazy. Again, you see shorts getting liquidated, right? So there's like a pretty balanced market there. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure we'll have some pretty big leverage related pullbacks along the way, but it certainly just doesn't have that same feel of some of the euphoria of the past.
We're seeing, and this is based on your report, Ethereum ETFs saw big inflows, but ETH in general has underperformed. You're also seeing strong fee growth for protocols like EtherFi, Avalanche, despite muted token prices. I mean, on that note, what does that signal to you?
The space has a lot of really good builders. And I think that a lot of the lessons, certainly not all of them, but a lot of the lessons learned from the prior cycles have like been addressed, maybe not fully, but have been addressed in recent kind of tech iterations. And of course, we're still iterating and improving, and there will be booms and busts, in the time ahead. Just the nature of the kind of market that we're dealing with. Like if you think of the EtherFi, for example, they have their card, they have this kind of like full, like, fintech PayFi type of like ecosystem, which is like pretty freaking awesome, actually. And for disclosure, maybe a bit of a spoiler, like I was talking to the editor of a payments magazine the other day, and I kind of explained this PayFi thing, which I hate the name, but like this new happening, and they were totally blown away. They're like, "What? I had no idea." Like, so this is what stablecoin use is, going towards, or whatever else. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like this is like banking the unbanked. Not necessarily in the case of EtherFi, but you have all these like awesome, really smooth use cases now where it's pretty easy to do some DeFi farming, or you do some yield farming, move that money over to something, and then pay for it in the real world. Whether that's tap your wallet at a vendor that accepts stable coins directly, or pay with a credit card, buy a gift card, or whatever else. There's lots of ways to like be a lot more seamless between like traditional finance and like the on-chain finance, and like that makes for a much better user experience. Gas fees are better, like especially on Ethereum right now. If you're trying to play around on there, it's a far cry from way back in the day. And there's guardrails too, or even within wallets. If you try to do something, it might get flagged. You'll be like, "Oh, careful! This might be suspicious." Or and other wallets other than MetaMask, like Phantom or Rabby or whatever, have much better experiences. So someone who gets onboarded there, just they're greeted with something a lot more fun to use. So I think that all kind of comes into play. ETH being 40 or whatever, 30 some odd percent below its all-time high still, along with Solana and others. I think, we had that kind of classic Bitcoin dominance, really doing quite well. That pulls back a little bit, and we'll see what ends up happening on a go forward. I mean, there's tons of treasuries that are corporate treasuries that are going and placing a healthy bid in Bitcoin. So, maybe dominance stays a bit higher. You're starting to see some new, kind of treasury vehicles show up in other assets too, which, we'll see what ends up happening there, but probably won't be the best outcome for a lot of investors. But, like these kind of things do kind of like place, they just kind of skew the supply demand imbalance, right? And then all of a sudden, if you're like someone who's wanting to sell, either you run out of your inventory, or if you're trying to play on the short side, you just start to like set back and let the market do its thing. And so all of that has this nice kind of setup for higher prices, of course, with some pullbacks along the way.
Yeah. To your point on the stable coins, I mean, things can only get even more exciting just because it is crypto week. And that means that one of the bills that could potentially be passed is the Genius Bill, which essentially addresses the stablecoin market. So that's something to look out for. And then going back to the DeFi aspect of what you said, in your report, DEX volume is up nearly 30% of spot trading. And in general, you're seeing a lot more investment into these DEXs that are mimicking and incorporating some of the attributes that you would find in a centralized exchange. And from my personal experience of working in the industry, I'm seeing some of those centralized exchanges start to struggle. I'm not talking about Coinbase or Binance, but the mid tier to low tier, they're really struggling for business. I feel like what you're seeing in terms of what's happening on chain is reflective of what I'm seeing in the industry, which is this shift towards more decentralized exchanges. Are you seeing that to be like the center of gravity that's shifting more towards on chain?
Like Hyperliquid obviously has to get a shout out in that, right? Like they provide a really awesome central limit order book experience with I think limited or no KYC, and with tons of liquidity there too, right? So I think to the extent that people can avoid centralized exchanges after some of the blowups of the past, there will be some people who are like, yeah, I got to get out of there. Others will look at trade across different venues simply for diversification's sake. And so if you have something on chain that has a little bit of the that reduces some of your counterparty risk, as you look to trade, and potentially, of course, has new opportunities for diversified profit generation, then you're going to do that. Hype has created its own kind of like flywheel. People are still playing for a second airdrop as well. So like, to the extent that like some of this DEX volume kind of comes in, we'll see. I think back in the day, a lot of the DEX volume was in, the longer tail assets, right? That's kind of like the thing that Uniswap solved really well with end of the AMN. Whereas now you have like these central limit order books, which are kind of like hybrid exchanges. Again, like it's just if you're managing large assets or trying to pay for an airdrop or whatever else, like you're not going to get that from a lot of the big guys. And so here you can start to trade. And I think people in crypto are kind of into trying new things too and kind of seeing where they go. And so I think there'll be a bit of that. And I think you can trade a lot of the kind of blue chip assets on like Solana dexes and elsewhere and stuff like that too. So I think it makes sense to see some of that kind of give back, especially after last cycle where the centralized exchange was so heavily scrutinized. And really, frankly, like since the beginning of crypto has been the source of like huge losses for a lot of people. So it's good. I think it's healthy to see, but I wouldn't count out the centralized exchange yet.
That's why we have you on to give us the scoop. Sebastian, I want to ask you about the venture side. There's still a strong emphasis on infrastructure and DeFi, which typically is what we see around more of like bear markets, right? Venture capital firms, they like to play it safe. And then once you reach this like euphoric phase, you start to see more funding in like consumer applications, maybe even GameFi, and more of these like risk on narratives that are interesting, but they're just a lot more risky. Are you starting to see that shift yet, or is it still early and most of the emphasis is on infra and DeFi?
So I would break that down even further. I would say like I totally agree with you on the infra side of things, and you saw an absolute boatload of like it was like all infra for the longest time. There may be a slight pause in that now. You have like these really strong ecosystems like Base, Hype EVM, And then maybe even some of the like like the BNBs of or the Binance Smart Chain of the world, and some of these other peripheral assets who have a lot of users on them, where like applications there could kind of catch fire, like things that's like warp cat or Farcasters had a nice little renaissance and stuff like that. So you might see some apps there, but actually DeFi is one that did kind of go to zero for a while. Like you didn't see much there, and then in the last like maybe 4 or 5 months, it was kind of ranked second after infrastructure, kind of very quite consistently. And actually, I think that plays into some of those themes I talked about before, where DeFi protocol, like I don't know if we're at DeFi 2.0 or 3.0 or who knows what now, but like the more modern DeFi protocol today has account abstraction built into it, has speed, low gas fees, has learned from projects that came before it. And so they maybe they're like less susceptible to problems in the code and so on and so forth. And just makes for a much better user experience. And then if you layer on top of that some of the agentic stuff that's going on, it's like, wow, DeFi as like having its day again here. It's pretty interesting. So I think like a lot of those themes that we talked about kind of more broadly are playing out in DeFi. It's like, stable coins and then DeFi would be kind of like, my kind of picks for killer apps and or killer use cases in crypto. And, I think a lot of that, like some of the narrative change of things is interesting too. Like I mentioned that PayFi again, where, which is really just like a blending of traditional financial rails, DeFi, and then like, wallet tech and applications and like, this kind of like fintech idea. A lot of that it like kind of like just plays right in like natively within like it's an application, an ecosystem. And then, to be able to bolt that onto different chains makes a lot of sense. And so I feel like DeFi is still, way further ahead than games. Games is a tricky one. It's struggled in crypto. I think as you financialize things, it can make it more fun for a bit, but then that's like that could be quite fleeting, especially like there's not too many people who love to go to the casino all the time. Not exactly the most sustainable type of user. So I think, games are a bit trickier. We'll see. You've seen some attempts and some reattempts and some success there. Could be a place. I mean, for us in the venture space, it's not that was not a focus of ours. And then like other applications, like I think what Farcaster and Warpcaster, I saw a tweet the other day that said like the average cast is getting like 2.5 times the engagement that it used to. That's obviously off a very low base, but that's trending in the right direction. And it's cool to see some of these mini apps taking getting some attention across the space as well. So you look, a lot of the cool experiments that are happening before will also kind of get taken up in the same tailwinds that DeFi is of faster experience, more seamless, abstracted tech, and all that kind of stuff, which I think just bodes well for the space. So,
Sebastian, what's like the one metric or chart from the report that you put out that you feel people are overlooking, but you think it's really crucial right now based on where we're at?
like outside of USDC and USDT, so some of these other kind of like fintech stable coins. So you got PYUSD, USDG, which is tied to Robinhood, and then Ripple's USD, which but they're still really small, $500 million. But I'll be watching this one very closely because if you're PayPal's board of directors and you see what's like, your share price versus like Robinhood or Coinbase's or whatever else, right? Again, like I'm sure they're not thinking this way, purely, but and then you're like, okay, well, hold on, we've got this PYUSD, we've got a favorable regulatory backdrop. Like, what do we do? How do we become a little bit more crypto? Especially now that like JP Morgan is going to charge us more for like for banking data and stuff like that. Well, like there's ways to do that. You've got this PYUSD, you could incentivize, you could, whatever else. And like, I wouldn't be surprised if you see some battle and like, kind of like we saw in like DeFi summer of like, token incentives or discounts or whatever it might be, and some like increase in customer acquisition cost amongst these guys as they fight for market share. And so, we haven't really seen it yet. PayPal's done a little bit of incentivization, Robinhood and USDG, which is a consortium of kind of like fintechs. And then, of course, there's Ripple, which with, incredibly deep pockets on the XRP side of things. So I don't know. Like to me, I'm watching that. I bet you see that chart explode higher And I don't know. I think the market share shifts considerably too. But I think that one's one that I'm keeping an eye on. And then like the one on the side there, Aptos. It's like wouldn't be surprised if you see some growth in other ecosystems on the stablecoin side, right? Like I know Tron, for example, pretty famously, just has Tether there, but I think there's some projects that are building to try to bring some innovation to that ecosystem. Plasma obviously is a good example there, and as you start to have other chains with applications built on top of them, I think you just see that stablecoin kind of like spread across a lot more cross chain, and but mostly the one on the left there. I think that one's one to keep a close eye on, at least one for me that I'm watching. And then kind of related to that, if you go to the slide 18 on this like closing the gap here, like it's like we're a far cry, but just to give you an idea of like the Maker, Lido, Aave. Like Aave's had huge success. I think it's up like $70 billion now on its platform just in the last few weeks, like since I published this even. And this is a chart from Token Terminal, by the way. I should give them credit. But like like if you think Robinhood, Coinbase up there as the bigger big winners. If you look at like Aave, Lido, Sky, maybe even like an EtherFi with its kind of like PayFi ecosystem. I'm not saying they're going to rival Robinhood or Coinbase anytime soon, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see a bit more like crypto native projects in this side of things soon, or maybe you see PayPal or like Ripple more represented here. But we'll see.
Yeah, going back to the previous slide, I did notice that the stablecoin volume for Ripple and as well for Robinhood is starting to gain a little bit of traction over the PayPal stablecoin. So that was kind of a interesting thing to note as well.
PayPal was there early. They got a lawsuit from the SEC, like maybe 3 quarters ago or something like that, or like they're under investigation. So I think when that happens, it's probably like, okay, hold the phone, and then I have to kind of like restart stuff. But they've done the deal with Coinbase. I think that they're definitely trying to incent like move forward, and it just again I think like pressure starts to build on management and the board as you start to see your peers who are more crypto focused like start to like flap you. It's like, okay, do we just shelve this or like do we go all in? And I don't know exactly. Like I don't know like the PayPal board very well or like how they've looked in the past. It's a stock I follow kind of periphery like because of these kind of things. But it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, you guys were there. You had kind of put some effort into it, and I know like I've seen some podcasts with the team there, and like they're kind of looking. But obviously, Robinhood was pretty splashy at FinCon, and then Ripple is Ripple. So it's like like what do? You kind of have to make a call. Either like you stop investing or you make an investment. And I think all of those companies and maybe JP Morgan, JPMD, and all that kind of stuff, you'll start to see this kind of like Cambrian explosion of other cryptos, other stable coins that will grow the pie.
The stablecoin story is definitely one to continue to watch, and especially with all of the regulatory things that are unfolding in Capitol Hill. Sebastian, I always appreciate your reports. I think everybody watching this should go and subscribe to your newsletter. You put out this report every month. So a lot of times it's good to know what happened in the past to understand where we are moving forward. And those that are watching, if you want to join these types of conversations and connect with folks like Sebastian, if you're an operator or builder in the space, go to networkspotlight.io and apply to become a member. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and we'll catch you on the next one. If you're a founder or operator in Web3 and want to connect with others like you, head on over to networkspotlight.io and apply to become a member. See you on the inside.